A 3-year-old girl points at her father's coffin. Then they hear a sound inside. The church was filled with a heavy silence, broken only by the soft sobs of mourners. The air was thick with the scent of melting candle wax and fresh flowers placed near the coffin. The towering stained-glass windows cast colorful shadows on the cold marble floor, yet none of it could brighten the grief that weighed on Olivia's chest. She stood beside the wooden coffin, her black dress clinging to her as if it, too, was mourning. Her husband, Ethan, was gone, at least, that was what everyone believed. Tightly clutched in her arms was her 3-year-old daughter, Emma. The little girl had been restless throughout the service, wriggling in Olivia's grasp, her small body warm but trembling. Emma's face was streaked with tears, her tiny hands gripping her mother's sleeve with desperate urgency. Olivia tried to hush her, whispering soothing words against her ear, but Emma refused to be comforted. Her large, innocent eyes were fixed on the coffin in front of them. "Papa, Papa," Emma sobbed, pointing her tiny finger at the sealed wooden box. Olivia's throat tightened. She pulled Emma closer, pressing the girl's head against her shoulder. "Shoo, baby," she whispered, voice thick with emotion. "Papa's sleeping now." But Emma struggled, pushing against her mother's hold. "No, Mama. Papa's not gone. He's trapped. He's calling me." Her voice grew louder, urgent and filled with panic. The church fell into an eerie stillness. The murmuring of the mourners faded, and heads slowly turned toward Olivia and her daughter. Some exchanged worried glances, while others made the sign of the cross. An elderly woman, Madame Rose, stepped forward, her wise eyes clouded with something between fear and curiosity. "The child sees something," she murmured under her breath, clutching the rosary beads around her fingers. Olivia's heart pounded against her ribs. She swallowed hard and bent down, cupping Emma's tear-streaked face in her hands. "Sweetheart," she whispered, her voice shaking slightly, "why do you think Papa is calling you?" Emma hiccuped, her small chest rising and falling in rapid breaths. She pointed again, this time toward the dark space behind the coffin. "Papa is scared," she whispered. "He said he needs help." A chill ran through Olivia's spine. The weight of the church's silence pressed against her like an unseen force. She turned toward the coffin, her eyes searching for something, anything, that could explain Emma's distress. It was irrational. It was impossible. But deep inside, a seed of fear had been planted. A sudden gust of wind swept through the church, making the candles flicker wildly. A few guests gasped, stepping back instinctively. Olivia tightened her grip on Emma. The priest cleared his throat. "Children grieve in different ways," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "She is young. She doesn't understand what has happened." But Olivia wasn't sure. Because when she looked back at Emma, she saw something in her daughter's eyes that made her stomach twist with dread. Pure, unshakable certainty. A thick tension settled over the church. The once soft murmurs had turned into hushed whispers, rippling through the crowd like an invisible current. The weight of Emma's words clung to the air, leaving a chilling unease in its wake. Olivia could feel the villagers shifting uncomfortably, their eyes darting between her, the coffin, and the frightened little girl in her arms. Emma was still pointing, her tiny finger trembling. "Papa is scared," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Olivia's breath hitched. Her hands trembled as she smoothed Emma's golden curls, her own mind battling logic and fear. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be possible. Yet, the certainty in her daughter's eyes made Olivia's stomach twist with unease. A sudden, sharp voice broke the silence. "That's enough." Brandon, Ethan's cousin, stepped forward from the crowd, dressed in a crisp black suit. His dark eyes flickered with something unreadable, annoyance, perhaps, or something far more sinister. Olivia had never fully trusted him, and now, as he moved closer, she felt an instinctive urge to step back. "She's just a child," Brandon said, forcing a chuckle that held no warmth. "She doesn't understand what's happening." His gaze flickered toward the villagers. "Let's not let grief turn into hysteria." The words sent a shiver down Olivia's spine. There was something calculated about the way he spoke, something almost rehearsed. Emma buried her face against Olivia's shoulder, her small body still shaking. "Mama," she whimpered, gripping her dress. Olivia hesitated before turning to Brandon, her voice sharper than before. "Why are you so quick to dismiss this?" she asked, narrowing her eyes. Brandon's jaw tensed for the briefest moment before he plastered on a sympathetic expression. "Because I know how grief works," he said smoothly. "It makes people hear things, see things that aren't there. You've been through enough, Olivia. You don't need to add unnecessary worry to your plate." Unnecessary worry. The word struck her wrong. Something about the way he said them, about the way he was watching her, felt off. But before Olivia could respond, Brandon sighed heavily, rubbing his temple as if weighed down by a terrible burden. "Listen," he said, lowering his voice, "I didn't want to bring this up today, but it's important. Ethan, he left behind a lot of financial trouble." Olivia stiffened. "What?" Brandon nodded solemnly. "Debts, Olivia. A lot of them. The house," he paused for effect, shaking his head. "It might be best to sell it now, settle everything before things get worse." The words hit her like a slap. Sell the house? The home she and Ethan had built together? The place where Emma had taken her first steps? She took a step back, tightening her hold on Emma. "No," she said firmly. "Ethan never told me anything about debts." Brandon exhaled sharply, as if disappointed. "I'm only trying to help," he said, his voice softer, but his eyes remained cold. Olivia's heartbeat quickened. Something wasn't right. She could feel it. And when Emma's voice cut through the thick air again, her words only made that feeling worse. "Papa is still here," she whispered. "And he's crying." The church had never felt so cold. A heavy silence fell over the mourners as Olivia's mind raced, her heart pounding so violently she could feel it in her throat. Emma's words kept echoing in her head, "Papa is still here, and he's crying." The villagers stood frozen, their faces filled with fear and uncertainty. No one knew what to believe anymore. But Olivia could feel something deep in her gut, something that told her this was not just a grieving child's imagination. A sharp gust of wind rattled the stained glass windows, causing the candles on the altar to flicker. The priest, Father Thomas, cleared his throat as if trying to regain control of the uneasy crowd. "Perhaps we should take a moment to." Then it happened. Thud. A sound, low, dull, and unmistakable, echoed from inside the coffin. The reaction was immediate. A woman let out a startled gasp. Someone else whispered a frantic prayer. A few villagers took nervous steps back, their eyes widening in terror. Then, it happened again. Thud. Thud. A frantic knocking. From inside the coffin. Emma clutched Olivia's dress, her tiny fingers digging into the fabric. "Mama," she whimpered, tears streaming down her face. "Papa is calling us." Olivia's breath came in short gasps. Her knees threatened to buckle beneath her, but she refused to collapse. She turned to look at Brandon, who stood stiffly near the coffin, his face drained of all color. His hands were clenched into tight fists, and beads of sweat trickled down his temple. "What the hell is going on?" Matthew, Ethan's closest friend, demanded, stepping forward. His voice was sharp, his body tense like a coiled spring. That, he pointed to the coffin, was not the wind. Brandon swallowed hard. "You're all letting grief get the best of you," he muttered, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "It's probably just shifting wood." "Shifting wood?" Olivia's voice cracked with rage as she stepped closer. "Brandon, my daughter has been saying since the beginning that Ethan is still here. And now, we're all hearing this?" She pointed at the coffin, her entire body shaking. "You expect us to believe that's just wood shifting?" More murmurs spread through the church. Fear was quickly turning into suspicion. Matthew had heard enough. He stormed toward the coffin, his jaw set with determination. "I don't care what anyone says. We're opening it. Now." Brandon's entire body tensed. "No," he barked, his voice cracking under the weight of panic. He lunged forward, but Matthew shoved him back with surprising force. Brandon stumbled, his eyes wild with desperation. "Get away from it!" Brandon shouted. "You don't understand." But it was too late. Matthew and another man, James, stepped forward, gripping the heavy wooden lid. With a deep breath, they prepared to lift it. The church held its breath. And then, the coffin began to open. The weight of the revelation pressed down on Olivia like a vice. Ethan had been buried alive. The thought alone was enough to make her stomach churn. Around her, the church had erupted into chaos. Some of the mourners gasped in horror, while others clutched their chests, whispering frantic prayers. The air felt stifling, thick with the scent of melted candle wax and the lingering chill of something unspoken, something dark. Emma clung to Olivia, her tiny hands gripping her mother's dress with desperation. "Mama," she whimpered, her voice shaking, "Papa is scared." Before Olivia could react, a strangled cry rang out. "No! This isn't happening. Brandon!" His face had turned deathly pale, beads of sweat forming at his temples despite the cold draft sweeping through the church. His hands clenched at his sides, his body rigid as though he had just seen a ghost. Olivia turned to face him, her pulse pounding in her ears. Brandon shook his head violently, his breath ragged. "This is madness. There's no way he's alive." His voice cracked with panic, his usual smooth demeanor shattered. The villagers weren't buying it. They were watching him now, not with sympathy, but with growing suspicion. The way he had tried to dismiss Emma's cries. The way he had urged Olivia to sell the house immediately. the way his hands trembled now, his eyes darting toward the coffin as if it might open and reveal something he had hoped would stay buried forever. Father Thomas stepped forward, his expression grim. "Brandon," he said carefully, "do you know something we don't?" Brandon's mouth opened and closed, his breath shallow. "Of course not," he snapped. "This is all just some misunderstanding. He was dead." The doctor confirmed it. At that moment, Dr. Carter, the forensic examiner, stepped forward. His voice was steady but carried the weight of a death sentence. "No, Brandon," he said, his gaze piercing, "the doctor who signed Ethan's death certificate doesn't exist. I checked. His signature was forged." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Olivia felt her stomach drop. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides as she turned toward Brandon. You did this." Brandon stumbled backward. "No," he stammered, I just. You did this." Olivia's voice thundered through the church, raw and filled with fury. Brandon's breath came in short, panicked gasps. Then, as if the truth could no longer be contained, he crumbled. His knees buckled, and he collapsed onto the cold stone floor, his shoulders shaking with something between fear and regret. "I didn't mean to kill him," he whispered, his voice hollow. "I just wanted him out of the way. I just needed the house." A stunned silence filled the church. Matthew stepped forward, his jaw clenched. "What did you do, Brandon?" Brandon swallowed hard, his face contorted with anguish. I put something in his drink," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "Just enough to knock him out. I thought he was already dead." His voice cracked. "I never checked." The room spun around Olivia. Ethan had been buried alive because of greed. And now, he was fighting to escape his grave. Brandon's confession sent a shockwave through the church. The weight of his words seemed to crush the very air in the room. People gasped, some covering their mouths in horror. Others whispered among themselves, eyes darting toward the coffin where Ethan had just been pulled from his premature grave. The flickering candlelight cast eerie shadows on the stone walls, amplifying the chilling reality of what had just been revealed. Olivia stood frozen, her chest rising and falling with rapid breaths. Her hands clenched at her sides, fingernails digging into her palms. Every fiber of her being burned with rage. This man, this monster, had buried her husband alive. "You buried him," she whispered, her voice barely holding back the storm brewing inside her. Brandon remained on his knees, his shoulders shaking, his hands gripping his head as if he could erase what he had just admitted. "I didn't know," he cried. "I thought he was dead." "You never checked," Olivia roared. Her voice echoed through the church, laced with grief, fury, and the unbearable realization of how close she had come to losing Ethan forever. A deafening silence followed, broken only by Emma's soft sobs. She clung to Olivia's leg, her little face buried in her mother's dress. The church doors burst open. Sheriff Anderson stormed in, followed by 2 deputies. His sharp gaze swept over the shaken crowd before settling on Brandon, who still cowered on the floor. "What the hell is going on here?" the sheriff demanded. Matthew stepped forward, his face as hard as stone. "Brandon tried to kill Ethan. He faked the death certificate, had him buried alive. The sheriff's eyes darkened, and within seconds, his deputies seized Brandon by the arms. The once composed businessman let out a strangled cry, struggling as the cold steel of handcuffs snapped around his wrists. No, wait. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. Brandon screamed. I didn't mean. Save it, Sheriff Anderson growled. You have the right to remain silent. I suggest you use it. The church erupted into murmurs as Brandon was hauled to his feet. His face was pale, his breathing erratic. But no one felt pity for him. As the officers dragged him toward the door, Olivia stepped into his path. Her voice was eerily calm. You were willing to let my husband rot in the ground. You don't deserve mercy. Brandon lowered his head, unable to meet her gaze. Then, just as he was being led away, Emma's soft, trembling voice rang out. Papa's safe now. Tears welled in Olivia's eyes as she turned back to Ethan. He was weak, his body trembling from exhaustion, but his eyes, those deep, familiar eyes, were open, alive. She rushed to his side, gripping his hand as fresh tears rolled down her cheeks. You're safe now, she whispered, pressing her forehead against his. You're really here. Ethan, voice barely above a breath, managed one word. Home.